These are Soviet bus stops. This is one in Armenia, this is one in Tajikistan, and this is one in Abkhazia. They all have one thing in common. They're fantastical, expressive, and above all, cool. These bus stops don't exactly align with the common perception of the Soviet Union as an empire of concrete, of conformity and uniformity. They stand in direct contrast to the USSR's infamous and often derided prefabricated apartment complexes, which the Western world colloquially refers to as commie blocks. The question is why? Why did a state typically obsessed with conformity and standardization in architecture opt to allow such elaborate and excessive structures? Their existence is ever more confusing because in 1955, the then leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, had effectively banned all forms of extravagant architecture. He had passed this law, a resolution on, quote, combating the excesses of architecture and construction, which specified that architects and engineers should conduct a daily, irreconcilable struggle with the manifestations of formalism in architecture and with the excesses in design and construction. Now, Soviet law was often cloaked in highly ceremonial language, but what this essentially meant was that the state intended to clamp down on architecture that focused on form over function. Khrushchev had personally attacked Soviet architects who were primarily trained in the classical school merely a year prior to the enacting of the law. He had stated that in our construction industry there is often a waste of money, and this is the fault of many architects who allow excesses in the decoration of buildings built according to individual design. He added, "You can't turn a modern residential building into a church or a museum. People need flats. They do not need to admire silhouettes, but to live in houses." Khrushchev was about to herald in the complete revamping of the Soviet architectural profession, shifting from the more stylized and opulent architecture of the Stalin era to a frugal utilitarianism that aimed to cut costs and increase housing supply. Now, when we look at some of these bus stops, like this one in Abkhazia, we can identify a few things that might have irritated Khrushchev. It lacks a roof and walls, leaving those waiting for a bus exposed to the elements, something that is distinctly not utilitarian or functional. Another bus stop in Russia, in Stavropol Krai, has a gigantic metal statue of a man on a horse teetering on what appears to be a machinery shed. Within the shed itself dangles a strange centerpiece, a metal treasure chest held aloft by 4 chains. The designer of this particular stop clearly favoured decorative ornamentation over practicality, and the design appears to be entirely unique, 2 construction trends that Khrushchev had railed against vehemently. Khrushchev and his regime were also fixated on the prefabrication and standardization of design and construction in order to cut costs and optimize production. So when we look at this next bus stop, an onion-shaped monstrosity in Saransk, Russia, we might think to ourselves, this doesn't look like a particularly scalable piece of public infrastructure. It's another building that appears to be entirely out of line with Soviet architectural philosophy. An important point to make, though, is that most of these bus stops were constructed after Khrushchev relinquished the reins of power between the late 1960s and the early to mid-1980s under the tenure of the new leader, Leonid Brezhnev. However, Brezhnev's policy towards architecture was marked more by apathy than a radical reappraisal of the status quo. Construction projects, particularly residential ones, retained many of the drab features of the Khrushchev era, and even when Brezhnev began to reverse some of the bland architecture of his predecessor, that is still not enough to explain this explosion in bus stop-related creativity. Indeed, the Brezhnev period was commonly referred to as an era of technical, economic and cultural stagnation, and not one of blossoming architectural creativity. So why do these bus stops even exist at all? There might be a clue within the bus stops themselves. If we look at a few of them, we can see that they are often plastered in ideologically charged imagery. This Kazakh bus stop, for example, has a mural of agricultural machinery and wheat emblazed onto it, a theme reflected in many of the Soviet Union's propaganda posters that intended to communicate themes of progress, prosperity, and celebrations of Soviet labour. Another bus stop in Ivanovo, Russia, depicts a brightly coloured mural of a Soviet cosmonaut, mirroring another common trend in Soviet propaganda of the veneration of scientific progress through their space program. If one digs a little bit deeper into Brezhnev's opinion on what function art in general should serve, you'll find that he was very much of the conviction that it should reflect the tenets of socialist realism, a state-sponsored art movement that intends to present a utopian image of the USSR and communism. In one March 1971 report, Brezhnev stated that, quote, "The party continues, as it always has done, to devote much attention to the ideological content of our literature and art and the role they play in society. We believe that our task is to direct the development of all forms of creative art towards participation in the people's great cause of communist reconstruction." So this might provide some rationale as to why these bus stops were permitted, because they often functioned as vehicles for state propaganda. But many of these bus stops are devoid of socialist imagery. Most of them tend to reflect the local environment or culture and are adorned with traditional art. This bus stop in Balchiki, Kyrgyzstan is inspired by the traditional Kyrgyz Ak-Kalpak hat. This one in Sevan, Armenia, reflects the local fishing industry and heritage, while this one by a dried-up Aral Sea in Kazakhstan takes architectural cues from the nation's Islamic roots, with a miniature minaret acting as the building's statement piece. This too, however, is an element of official Soviet doctrine. The incorporation of communal identity in the architectural makeup of bus stops was recommended explicitly by a government-issued handbook. This document, issued under the name of Methodical Recommendations for the Design of Bus Stops, stated that attention should be paid to modern architectural design in accordance with the climatic, local, and national characteristics of the area. It also adds ornamentation reflecting national and local flavour should be used for the decoration of bus stops. Initially, this might also sound fairly out of character for the Soviet Union. Being socialist, they typically weren't obsessed with tradition or customs, right? That is largely a misconception. The Soviet Union, as a result of Lenin's insistence on national representation and cultural independence, was actually an empire that afforded significant autonomy to its ethnicities. This autonomy and cultural independence would often be co-opted and repackaged to convey a socialist message. Basically, if it was nationalistic in form but socialist in content, it became an expedient tool to propagate ideology. The Welsh scholar C. Vaughan James, in his treatise on socialist realism, explained that within official Soviet doctrine, a socialist society not only preserves the best in folk or popular art, it instills new ideas into them, leading to a fusion of traditional forms with the finest achievements of academic art. Vladimir Lenin, again an ever-present lodestar in Soviet doctrinal development, also indicated that traditional art was critical to the ideology he had helped ferment in Russia. Art must have its deepest roots in the very depths of the broad masses of workers, he said. It must be understood by those masses and loved by them. It must unite the feelings, thoughts, and will of the masses and raise them up. So these bus stops fulfilled these criteria exceptionally well. Not only did they provide the canvas to exploit national values and cultural imagery in the various Soviet socialist republics and repackage it into Soviet pride, but they also acted as a way to bring art to the masses. It would meet the average worker, farmer, craftsman at the point they most frequented, the start of their commute to work. It was simultaneously an ingenious method of distribution and one that could be easily understood by the majority of people. Widely understood local imageries and Soviet ones were melded into one coherent whole. The less imaginative of these bus stops, the concrete outliers that had no explicit political or ideological ties, were likely a product of another distinctly Soviet phenomenon. A sometimes arbitrary bureaucracy wrestling in tandem with the inconsistent whims of Soviet leaders. These bus stops were both the products of intentional Soviet policy, yet occupied a space where they were insignificant enough to sometimes be able to slip through the cracks, and thus a thorough vetting process, either because no one cared or because no one noticed. In this liminal space, some hilariously impractical bus stops were able to sneak their way through, and although they lacked utility, there's no questioning that these bus stops look really, really cool.
Wow, those bus stops were really cool, but you know what's cooler? Not having your data leaked online. If you're the type of person who hates that happening, then look no further than Private Internet Access VPN, the world's most transparent VPN. What's a VPN, you ask? Well, imagine you're waiting at a bus stop in the Soviet Union and your local KGB agent is eavesdropping on the conversation you're having with your comrade, Ivan. Wouldn't it be cool if you could make sure that that KGB agent couldn't hear you at all? Well, that's basically what a VPN does. It makes sure that nobody but the intended recipient of your data, or in this analogy conversation, is able to access it. Whether you're browsing the internet or entering in your card details on Toys R USSR, Private Internet Access steps in to make sure that your private information is kept away from the prying eyes of hackers, corporations, and even governments. Just pop over to the app, choose a server, and voila, the KGB can't snoop on you anymore. But that's not all. I personally use the app on a day-to-day basis to access content on streaming sites that I normally wouldn't have access to. Some content is only available in certain countries, and even the Netflix library changes according to your location. But with PIA, you'll be able to change your geolocation to 84 different countries and watch content from all over the world. This is how I'm able to watch, for example, John Wick Parabellum, which is only available in Australia, even though I'm halfway across the world in Switzerland. If you value your privacy and want to support my channel, then don't hesitate to click on the link below at www.piavpn.com/imperial to get a whopping 83% discount. That's just $2.03 a month and 4 months free. Thanks again to Private Internet Access for sponsoring today's video, and that's all from me.